The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
and by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. Key West is the southernmost point in the continental United States, just 90 miles from Cuba. The island community is known for its casual atmosphere, inclusive culture, and independent spirit. While the natural beauty of Key West attracts tourists throughout the year, historic buildings and museums contribute to the unique ambiance of the town and help to preserve the island's rich history. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. When Juan Ponce de Leon first spotted the Florida Keys in 1521, he thought that they looked like suffering men, so he named them Los Martires, or the Martyrs. The Spanish called Key West Cayo Hueso, or Bone Cay, because the native inhabitants had used the island as a burial ground.
But we're not sure of that story. A number of us believe that they called it Bone Island because the people that normally named islands were the navigators. And they usually named them for a reason, what they look like or something. So we think it looked like a bone.
So the popular legend of how Key West got its name may be apocryphal, and historians even disagree about who the original inhabitants of the island were. Some believe they were the Calusa from southwest Florida. Others argue it was the Tequesta from southeast Florida that made their way to Key West.
So the Calusa mainly are the Native Americans who would have inhabited the Keys, although Key West really would not have been inhabited from the get-go. There was not much access to fresh water here, so this was more of a transient island for them while they were fishing and hunting and would go back and forth between Cuba and the Everglades area.
The original inhabitants were probably Tequestas. Bob Carr, as you're familiar with, has determined probably the pottery is more Tequesta than the other one.
For centuries, under Spanish control, Key West was a place where people would stop to fish, gather lumber, or recover from being shipwrecked. Not much changed when England took ownership of Florida from 1763 to 1783.
It was not the economic producer that the British demanded a lot of their West Indian islands to be, and so really it was not necessarily a factor. It was more of a bargaining chip in their relations in Europe rather than something that they exploited and used.
It seemed like more than Nassau fishermen, wreckers were working, they had been working the Florida Keys, but they increased their activity during that British time, though Spain never really gave up Florida Keys during that period of the English occupation of North Florida. They still claimed down here and had fishing boats working here and fishing for the Havana market.
Records indicate that when the United States claimed Florida as a territory in 1821, there was some confusion over who owned Key West.
The same confusion that had happened under the British. The Spanish still sort of considered this part of Cuba, and but it was not clear at all in the treaty reached where Florida ended, and so to settle the argument, the Navy sent the Navy Lieutenant Perry here to plant the flag and claim it as part of Florida, part of the United States.
Juan Pablo Salas bought the island of Key West in Cuba. He was a Cuban national, and there was some confusion whether or not he actually owned the island, who had rights to it. Eventually that was cleared up, and Juan Pablo Salas sold it to John Simonton, who most Key Westers celebrate as being really the first American who owned Key West and turned it over to the government soon after.
In addition to the military presence in Key West in the early 1800s, permanent residents started moving to the island. Most of them made their living from salvaging shipwrecks.
The mainstay of the economy was the wrecking industry, and many people suggest that around the 1840s, 1850s, Key West had the highest per capita income of any town in the United States because of the wrecking industry. They don't know that for sure, but certainly the wrecking industry was the key to the economy. Ships would wreck in the Florida Straits, and the wreckers, many of them from the Bahamas, New England, North Atlantic states, who came to Key West because of the wrecking industry, would go and rescue the sailors, rescue the cargo. If they could, they would repair the ships. If not, they would just auction off the cargo. And a lot of people made a lot of money off of the industry.
We are geographically positioned along a very long coral reef chain, very shallow. The navigation tools weren't as good as they are today. So certainly you can imagine, especially during inclement weather, wrong charts, it certainly was a bit of a mess out there along the reef line.
The wreckers, after the United States took over and the federal court was established here, was a closely regulated industry. Had licenses, had rules. Judge Marvin, who was the long ruling judge here, federal judge, was very strict and required them to do it. Now you hear stories about people doing illicit things and so forth. Now before the federal court was established, when Florida Keys was really in doubt between the English, the Spanish, and the Americans, sort of anything would go in those days, I guess.
We had commercial fishing, always important, and some of the wrecking boats actually engaged in commercial fishing as well. Sometimes they would sail and so they catch in Cuba, but also we did have the turtling industry develop, and that was significant for decades. Also, the sponging industry was very important for decades. It was initially eclipsed by Tarpon Springs by around 1900 or so, but that also was important. And again, with the sponging industry, many of those engaged in it came to Key West from the Bahamas, both whites and blacks. Also, the military was important on and off in Key West. Commodore Porter in 1823 formed his anti-pirate squadron. They were based in Key West. They went into the Caribbean area to try to fight off the pirates. And on and off, Key West has had a very significant military presence, especially during World War II. It was a military town.
The salvaging started ending with basically the Civil War because lighthouses were being built. There was still some wrecking going on, but the big moneymaker in the 1880s was the Cuban hand-rolled cigars. It was the driving industry of Key West from 1880, 1870s up until early 1900s, World War I, 1920. It was the major industry, and Havana hand-rolled Key West cigars were the ultimate on the market.
When Spain still had control of Cuba, they were levying huge taxes on the exportation of cigars. And what a lot of Cubans realized quite quickly was that our temperature, our climate in geography is so similar that they were able to start cigar manufacturing places here in Key West. And it was great because then they didn't have to pay the taxes.
After the 10-year war began, 1868, for Cuban independence from Spain, shortly thereafter, Ybor, for example, moved a cigar factory from Cuba to Key West. Others already had located here, so he wasn't the first. So many manufacturers opened cigar factories in Key West, and it was the mainstay of the economy for decades. By 1885, there were more Cuban immigrants in Key West than Bahamians, and that was due to the cigar industry because they had been skilled, many of them, in rolling cigars. And that was the key to the changing nature of the island. You had many kind of cigar worker areas formed, neighborhoods that were very, very prominent, and institutions supporting the cigar workers. And also because of the heavy Cuban population, Key West, along with Tampa and other communities, were in the forefront of gathering support for the Cuban War for Independence, the Second War, which began in 1895.
Another unique thing of the cigar industry here and in Tampa is they had readers or lectors who would read to the workers as they rolled cigars in the factory. So they were educated and knew what was going on, because one of the things they would read would be the paper or something, and they would see how much Mr. Ebor or Mr. Gatto was making per year from his cigars, and they would say, well, you know, we want more, and so they would have strikes. And Tampa offered them control the labor force, which didn't work up there either. They had the same labor problems that, and in some cases, but worse labor problems than had happened in Key West.
In 1912, Henry Flagler brought his East Coast Railway to Key West, connecting the island to the mainland for the first time.
He had built his railroad to Miami, and in fact tried to make a deep water port in Miami, and the technology of the time, he couldn't do it. And as a result, one of the reasons he had come is Cuba was now under American influence and trade. And Teddy Roosevelt had been elected president and was going to build the Panama Canal. So he saw as a deep water port that he could trade with Cuba and Panama. The second part never happened, but the Cuba part did. So he made a logical business decision to run his railroad. People call it at times folly, but it was a business decision.
1935 hurricane destroyed a good portion in the upper Keys of Henry Flagler's overseas railroad. The car had already come into fashion, and what I think a lot of people don't realize is that part of the overseas highway was already open by the time the railroad was destroyed.
We'd already built a partial highway that opened in 1929. It had a ferry ride in it, but you could get from Key West to the mainland by car. And then after the 35 hurricane, the state bought the right-of-way, the railroad right-of-way, and run the highway basically over what we travel today, except we got new bridges. But outside of that, we're mostly on the right-of-way of the Flagler East Coast Railroad.
Sloppy Joe's in Key West is a popular tourist destination today. In the 1930s, it was the favorite bar of the town's most celebrated resident, writer Ernest Hemingway. While living in Key West, Hemingway wrote works including the novel To Have or Have Not, and some of his best-loved short stories like The Snows of Kilimanjaro.
When you read it about him, you hear a lot about the Sloppy Joes, but he was a very disciplined writer, that he would get up every morning and write before he did any of the drinking or the fishing. So he was very disciplined, and then after that, he did a lot of fishing. His real thing here was fishing, and then he liked to party too. But he became, he was one of the world's experts on marlin fishing.
And he's quite the character. He's frequenting bars and restaurants, and he gets very friendly with a lot of the locals here, and he enjoys the culture because, of course, he's fishing all the time, and he's able to write, and he's found this quiet workspace.
And Ernest decided he loved the place. He stayed here for a while. He got to know some locals, some friends of his came down, and he lived in Key West, initially in a variety of places. Then he moved into what we call the Hemingway House in 1934, and he was here most of the 1930s on and off. He also often traveled a lot. Initially, he loved the island. Then when tourists began coming in relatively large numbers, he began to have second thoughts. He moved away in part because he met Martha Gellhorn at Sloppy Joe's, who became his third wife. They moved to Cuba, but also, according to one of his biographies, he probably would have moved away anyhow as more and more tourists arrived.
For as much as Hemingway was here, if Hemingway was probably here about 9.5 years and would leave frequently, I think people overlook Tennessee Williams. He is an amazing, American playwright, and he called Key West home for almost 40 years. He bought a house here. He enjoyed the solace. He enjoyed the ability to write. He was a notorious swimmer, and he just loved swimming in pools and at the beach, and he found that really relaxing before he would write. And he loved to bring his New York Broadway friends to Key West, and so because of Tennessee Williams really than anybody else, I think Key West opened up as a little bit more avant-garde because of the folks that were coming down here, actors, actresses, directors, who's who with money, the financial supporters, and it really became something because of Tennessee Williams.
It was his home from the late 40s until his death. He considered Key West his home, and he was the one that said, he could write anywhere, but he wrote best at his pool house in Key West. So he was part of the community. As one of the things I've shown you, he was a supporter of the library, and in fact the auditorium in our library is named for him, and he was here to dedicate it. And he was a member, and we even have his overdue notice where he didn't return a book on time. But he was a big supporter of the community, a part of the community.
U.S. President Harry S. Truman spent nearly 6 months of his presidency in Key West. The 1890 Navy officers' residence where he stayed became known as the Truman Little White House. While working in Key West, Truman signed documents that would advance civil rights, help lead to the creation of Israel, and result in the firing of General Douglas MacArthur.
He spent many what he called working vacations here. Again, many people came to visit him, many government officials, including members of the Supreme Court, at least one, which is kind of interesting. He played poker with a justice of the Supreme Court, which today might be frowned upon, I don't know. But yes, he just loved Key West. He got to know a lot of the families that were here, and the Little White House is now a prominent tourist attraction.
By the mid-20th century, Key West was attracting people who were seeking alternative lifestyles, including artists, musicians, and hippies.
It was after the naval station closed and the Duval Street closed. I mean, almost every business on Duval Street closed because it was all Navy. So the Flower Children or whatever came in and started opening shops and, handicraft stuff. And it was cheap. Rent was cheap. You could, rent a store building on Duval Street for peanuts in those days because there wasn't anybody down there.
They engaged in hippie behavior, however you want to characterize that, in terms of drug use, etc. The locals responded to them in different ways. Some very positively, feeling they kind of livened up the island. Others were more critical, but they were an important part of the mix in the 60s and 70s, along with a growing gay population. The military was still there in large numbers until around 1974, when Crewman Annex, as it's now called, closed. Drug smuggling was very prominent. Shrimpers were very prominent from 1949, when they first found pink gold, as they called it, through the 70s and then into the 80s. So Key West had a very interesting mix of people, and the hippies were an important part of that mix.
The gay community recognized the potential in Key West for them to really develop what it could come into. There was a big gay community up in Fort Lauderdale already, and they came down here. Property was very inexpensive, and large portions of that population either bought a second home here or relocated. And they started businesses like Fast Buck Freddy's, Key West Aloe, the Key West Business Guild, and that really set the stage for many other members nationally in the gay community to move to the Keys.
Tennessee Williams was sort of credited as the founder because he came here, and then some of his friends, and then some of the New Yorkers. But at the same time, the Flower Children were coming in. Some of the New York people saw the potential here. The real estate was cheap, store fronts were cheap, and they started moving in and opening boutique-type stores on Duval Street and buying up some real estate. And that it was getting in pretty dilapidated shape and restoring them, and it was the start of what we have today, the tourist economy of today.
It was very, very important in a variety of ways. Fantasy Fest was initially started in 1979, in part due to the efforts of a number of gay business people who had moved to Key West in the preceding decade. They wanted to enhance tourism, gay tourism and straight tourism. They played a very major role in attracting tourists. Beyond that, they played a very major role in renovation of houses in what we call Old Town, the old section of Key West, near Mallory Square and so on. You had homes built decades and decades before that had undergone disrepair. Many gays purchased the houses, fixed them up, and with the gay presence came gentrification. The prices of housing skyrocketed, and today it's unaffordable to all but a small sect of the population.
The independent spirit of Key West residents actually led to the island briefly seceding from the United States in 1982.
1980, the Mariel boat lift happens, and 120 to 30,000 Cuban refugees land in Key West. Well, the national press kills the tourist industry. They portrayed it as, riots and so forth, which there was some riots, but there were other places where they moved the refugees to. Key West survived it, but it killed the tourist industry for 2 years there. So it starts recovering, and then the federal government puts up the roadblock up at Florida City, and everybody leaving Key West had to show an ID that they were American citizens.
There was a lot of racial profiling going on here in the early 1980s. The government put a checkpoint in the Upper Keys trying to find illegal people that had either migrated up from Cuba and other typically Hispanic nations. And what they wanted to do was just weed them out. And so they set a roadblock up in the Upper Keys, and we're stopping traffic and searching people's cars, looking for illegals, and it really infuriated the community here. They felt like they were under a microscope that they didn't deserve to be under, and the community got together and decided to secede from the United States as an incredible act of defiance.
So they said, well, we're just going to secede from the Union. And they did that. They announced in advance that they were going to secede. They said we're being treated like a foreign country with the Border Patrol, and we're going to succeed. They did so. They surrendered, I think it was an hour later or something like that. In the interim period, they had a Minister of Defense who used a loaf of Cuban bread to hit a sail over the head. And that was his version of firing a volley. They surrendered. They asked the United Nations for, I think it was $1 billion in foreign aid. They didn't get any, of course, but they did receive national attention for their secession, the formation of the Conch Republic. Of course, they still celebrate that every year. So it's kind of interesting. On one hand, what Key West is trying to do is attract more tourists, which many cities throughout the U.S. and the world were trying to do, but the strategy they used, secession, was somewhat unique.
One of the earliest visitors to Key West after it originally became part of the United States was naturalist, ornithologist, and artist John James Audubon. When he came to Key West in 1832, it's believed that he drew his depiction of the white-crowned pigeon in the garden of what is now called the Audubon House. Across the street from the Audubon House is one of the most recognizable buildings in Key West, the Custom House. It's the first historic building that cruise ship passengers docked at Pier B encounter almost as soon as they come ashore. Today, the Custom House is home of the Key West Art and History Museum.
This building originally, when it opened in 1891, was our post office. It was the customs office. It was also the federal courthouse building, and the lighthouse, the 7th District Lighthouse, was stationed in this building. So it was a very multi-purpose government building, and the Navy took over this building in the 1930s and used it as their civil servant office. So anybody that was civilian Navy can come in here and get their paychecks, file paperwork, and it sat derelict for a while when the Navy base closed in the 1970s until we were able to get the state of Florida to purchase it, and then we rent it from the state of Florida for the lump sum of $1 a year. We got that in the 1990s and then undertook a 9-year, $9 million restoration of the building, which is one of the finest examples of Richardsonian Romanesque architecture anywhere in the country.
Duval Street in Key West is named for William Pope Duval, first civilian territorial governor of Florida who served from 1822 to 1834. Today, Duval Street is in the heart of the historic Key West Tourist District. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime on the web at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
and by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.